Ancient Egypt, one of the most powerful civilizations of the Bronze Age. Conqueror of Nubia, breadbasket of the known world. Land of great wealth and beauty. Tamer of the Nile River, and builder of great monuments and temples that reach the heavens. Mother of civilization, and great wanderer of the world. But even this mighty kingdom nearly fell to ruin had it not been by the power and blessings of the Most High Hashem through a Hebrew man named Joseph. Shalom and welcome. This episode will cover the life of Joseph. Our goal is to figure out which dynasty and kingdom of Egypt was Joseph a part of. Also, our goal is to figure out the biology of the Egyptians and early Hebrews of this period. Our final goal is to see what modern human populations share similar genetic ancestry to populations living in Egypt during the dynasty and period of Joseph. Since we understand that Joseph's Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, is connected to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt in the 12th Dynasty, now let's actually go further to see if this is true. Is there archaeological evidence that Joseph was in this time period of Egypt? According to the paper titled Joseph in Egypt, first of 6 parts, it reads, Mainline contemporary scholarship and the Bible's own chronology in accord in dating Joseph sometime between 2000 and 16,000 BC. This time frame includes 2 important periods in Egypt's history: the Middle Kingdom 2000 through 1786 BC and the intermediate period 1786 through 1570 BC. However, before narrowing down our dates for Joseph anymore, let us first survey these 2 periods. The Middle Kingdom was one of Egypt's 3 greatest ages. The country was unified and prosperous and was in a process of conquering Nubia, located in what is today the Sudan. In the Bible, the area is called Ethiopia. The 8 pharaohs in this period comprised Egypt's 12th dynasty. The founder was the great Amenemhat I, 1991 through 1962 BC. He died by assassination, but not before he had associated his son Senuseret I with him on the throne as co-regent. Soseret in his long reign, 1971 through 1926 BC, campaigned with success in northern Nubia and built at no less than 35 sites in Egypt. The most important king of the 12th dynasty was Senuseret III, 1878 through 1843 BC. He renewed the efforts to conquer Nubia and was successful. All of Nubia, as far south as Simnah, was taken. Senuseret III also instituted great administrative reforms. He broke the power of the local nobility. These officials had been a thorn in the side of the pharaohs all through the 12th dynasty. We know little in detail of what Senuseret III did, but he did end the semi-independence of the so-called monarchs, provincial governors. We will have occasion to return to this point later. Under Amenemhat III, 1842 through 1797 BC, the Middle Kingdom reached its highest level of material prosperity. Egypt was very successful in foreign trade. The exploitation of mines and quarries was greater than ever before, and a project to reclaim land in the Phylum region and the west of the Nile Valley was completed. The final rulers of the 12th dynasty, including 1 female king, were weak. As central authority broke down, so did control of Egypt's borders with Syria-Palestine. This enabled an ever-expanding infiltration of Asiatics to enter Egypt's Delta region. Eventually, these Asiatics were able to seize control of northern Egypt, thus ending the Middle Kingdom period of Egypt's history. The second intermediate period, or as it's sometimes called the Hyksos period, was not a time of greatness for Egypt. The north was controlled by Asiatics, a group called the Hyksos, by the Egyptians. The south was ruled by local Egyptian dynasties of no great power or importance, at least in their early years. The Bible, on the other hand, provides us with some very specific chronological data regarding these events. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, a pivotal reference for all Old Testament chronology, dates the Exodus 480 years before the 4th year of Solomon, accepted by virtually all scholars as 966 BC. This places the Exodus in circa 1446 BC, a date which agrees with the so-called early date for the Exodus. Next, Exodus chapter 12 verse 40 states that Joseph came to dwell in Egypt 430 years before the Exodus. Thus, he came to Egypt in circa 1876 BC. These biblical references clearly show that Joseph ought to be dated in the Middle Kingdom rather than in the Hyksos period. Several specific points in Joseph's story confirm a Middle Kingdom rather than a Hyksos state for Joseph. In Genesis chapter 41, verse 14, Joseph is called out of prison to meet with the king. Before going to meet the king, Joseph puts on new clean clothes and shaves himself. This becomes understandable when we realize that the Egyptians were a clean people and were particularly offended by facial hair. This verse points to the Pharaoh being a native Egyptian, not a Hyksos. The latter, being Asiatic, were not bothered by facial hair and a general lack of cleanliness. When Joseph is rewarded and promoted by the Pharaoh for interpreting the king's dream, he is named to be ruler over all the land of Egypt. See Genesis chapter 41. The Hyksos never ruled all the land of Egypt, but the native Egyptian pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom did. Also, when Joseph is given a wife by the king as a reward for his interpretation of the dream, the woman is said to be the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. On was the center of solar worship in ancient Egypt. The chief god worshipped there was Ra, or Re, the northern manifestation of Amun-Ra, the supreme deity of both the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom periods of Egyptian history. The Hyksos, while they did not persecute the worshippers of Ra, did not give that deity the number one position. Their favorite deity was Set, a delta god, sometimes regarded by the Egyptians as nearly a devil-like figure. The Hyksos identified Set with the Palestinian god Baal, a god from their Canaanite homeland, who was very familiar to them. Now, if Joseph was being rewarded by a Hyksos king, it stands to reason that his new wife would not have been the daughter of a priest of Ra, but rather the daughter of a priest of Set. Once again, the Middle Kingdom seems a better choice for dating Joseph than the second intermediate period. Thus, relying on biblical chronology and historical material, we will place Joseph in the Middle Kingdom period under two great rulers, Senuseret II, 1897 through 1878 BC, and Senuseret III, 1878 through 1843 BC. Joseph entered Egypt as a slave. It is interesting to note that slavery was not a very old concept in Egypt. It had not existed earlier in the Old Kingdom, the period when the Great Pyramids were being built. Those structures were not, as is sometimes stated, built by slave labor. They were constructed by drafted peasant labor. The Middle Kingdom is the first major period in Egyptian history where slaves were well known. In the 1950s AD, the American Egyptologist William C. Hayes published a famous papyrus documented from the Middle Kingdom, which had a list of slaves on one side and a discussion of Egyptian prisoners on the other. In the new issue of Bible and Spade, we will examine the information this valuable papyrus provides us regarding the story of Joseph. It seems like historically and biblically, the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt is the best time period to place Joseph. But now let's listen to what scholars have to say about this subject. I compiled a compilation of videos that support Joseph being in the 12th dynasty Middle Kingdom period of Egypt. These videos will also illustrate alternative pharaohs in the 12th dynasty that Joseph could have served under.
Now buckle your seatbelts. If Jacob was 130 years old at this time, when Joseph was 40 years old, then common sense means Jacob had Joseph at the age of 90. In Genesis 30, after the birth of Joseph, Jacob asked to leave Laban's house, but Laban convinces him to stay, and for 6 years Jacob kept Laban's flock, leaving at the age of 96. So since Jacob left at 96 and stayed for 20 years, we've just proved that Jacob fled from his brother at the age of 76 and began dwelling in Laban's house at that time, in 1930 BC. If Joseph was born when Jacob was 90 years old, then he was born in 1916 BC. That would make the year that Joseph stood before Pharaoh 1886 BC. And if Egyptologists and historians are to be believed, this would fall toward the end of the rule of Pharaoh Senuseret II. Would you like to know what this pharaoh was known for? Senuseret II took a great deal of interest in the Fayum Oasis region and began work on an extensive irrigation system from Bahar Yosef through to Lake Moeris through the construction of a dike at El Lahoun and the addition of a network of drainage canals. The purpose of this project was to increase the amount of cultivatable land in that area. The importance of this project is emphasized by Senuseret II's decision to move the royal necropolis from Dashur to El Lahoun, where he built his pyramid. This location would remain the political capital for the 12th and 13th dynasties of Egypt. During the time of plenty from 1885 to 1879 BC, it is extremely likely that with Joseph at the helm, Pharaoh would have set his focus to cultivation to ensure, as the Bible puts it, so much grain was gathered that they eventually stopped counting it all. The 7 years of famine would begin in 1878 BC and run until 1872 BC, making Egypt extremely wealthy because while the nations around them were ill-prepared for the famine, Egypt was given warning and time to prepare, having more than enough grain to trade with its neighbors. Now, Senuseret II's reign ended in 1878 BC, and his son Senuseret III began his reign. Senuseret III ruled from 1878 BC to 1839 BC, during a time of great power and prosperity for Egypt. He is considered to be perhaps the most powerful Egyptian ruler of the dynasty. His reign gave rise to an era of peace and economic prosperity, and a revival in craftwork, trade, and urban development.
So, based on the new chronology's reconfiguration of when you will find Neferhotep I in the 13th dynasty, that is, in the 1500s BC, and then based on how the Bible paces the timeline of Joseph moving into Egypt, the Israelites prospering, falling into slavery, leaving Egypt and conquering the Promised Land, setting up a united kingdom and then a divided one, we should expect, if we reverse engineer it, to find Joseph to have been the vizier to one of the last pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, around the time of Amenemhat III. Amenemhat was the longest ruling king of the 12th dynasty, and during his reign, Egypt suffered a terrible and prolonged famine, which seems to have been caused by severe flooding from the Nile, not no rain. You can actually see the difference in statues of him and his father. Instead of the casual and almost glad-looking faces of pharaohs, he has bags under his eyes. His body is gaunt. His mouth is turned downward and his ears are wide open, facing his people, a sign of listening to the needs of his population and being humbled. There is evidence of major reorganization of Egypt's administration during the reign of Amenemhat III to combat high floods and famine. Land actually seems to have been confiscated, and a Department of State was set up to take in stores of food for rationing. On the southern border of Egypt, just to the south of the River Nile's second cataract, two fortresses were guarding entrance into Egypt, one on each side of the Nile. They were strategic for defense and also nearby some important gold mines. They were fortresses created in the 12th dynasty under Senuseret I and II, but their role of monitoring the high water marks of the Nile became crucial under Amenemhat III and his father Senuseret III. Towards the end of the 12th dynasty, Recorded on the cliff face in the gorge by the Nile, officials recorded a dramatic rise in the Nile flood levels. The average flood would have reached 40 feet up, but in year 3 of Amenemhat III, water levels began to increase up to a consistent 55 feet mark, likely bringing large amount of rich soil to Lower Egypt. But in year 20, the flood peak rose to 69 feet, producing 4 times the amount of water normally expected and inundating the Nile Valley with so much water you would not be able to sow or reap the fields. Temples were flooded, and agriculture basically ground to a halt. The records on the cliffside show that it happened over and over, and did not reach a normal level until around year 32 of his reign. The local rulers called nomarchs had grown rich and powerful in the 12th dynasty. They had huge tombs like pharaohs and obvious riches. But around the reign of Amenemhat III, all that stopped, indicating a sudden decline in the fortunes of local landowners. You could call it fortuitous, or even lucky, that in the years of rich soil deposits, the new administration set up a conscript workforce for careful production of land, even imposing a grain tax in good years, and the construction of granaries. Even a remarkable project began to divert water away from the Nile, a hand-dug canal branching water away from the Nile and creating a large reservoir, in classical literature called Lake Moeris, but may have derived from something like Nemoaria, closely related to the coronation name of Amenemhat III. At the spot where the desert plateau overlooks this channel is where Amenemhat III built his pyramid and famous labyrinth. Locals have called this canal Bahar Yusuf as far back as they can remember. This video is getting too long, so join us next time as we explore the Egyptian records of who was the royal vizier in this time period, and whether there is evidence of northerners from Syria moving into the region.
So let's start with the sojourn. We're going to work forward in time now, from the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt through to the Exodus and beyond. And it starts with prosperity, followed by slavery. You know the story. Joseph comes into Egypt as a slave. He rises to the ranks. He helps to explain Pharaoh's dreams for him. He becomes the highest official in the land. His family are brought in from Canaan during the famine period, and they are given the best part of Egypt to live in. They prosper and multiply, and then they're suddenly plunged into slavery. And then on comes Moses and the Exodus after that. But let's first of all look at the beginnings of all this. Just to recap where we are then, here is we're in now the Middle Bronze Age. Middle Bronze 1, Middle Bronze 2A, Middle Bronze 2B. That's the archaeology. In Egypt, this is the 12th dynasty, the 13th dynasty, and something called the Hyksos period, which I'll deal with in a moment. So, in this new timeline, Jericho was destroyed during the Middle Bronze 2B. We're not quite sure where in this phase, but it's somewhere in this period here. And then in the 12th dynasty, here we have the arrival of the Israelites. This is how it works with the biblical chronology in relationship to archaeology. And you'll notice something very interesting. We have one phase called Middle Bronze 2A, which is actually matching exactly with the Israelite sojourn in Egypt, and then we have the conquest 40 years later. So the Exodus takes place in the transition between Middle Bronze 2A and Middle Bronze 2B. And over here, at the end of the 13th dynasty, followed by the Hyksos period. Now, the Hyksos were invaders. They came into Egypt, and they took it over, and they dominated it for a couple of centuries. The Egyptian pharaohs were killed and slaughtered. Their families were murdered. The women were put into slavery, and the women were actually buried along with the warriors who died. They buried the Egyptian female slaves next to them. They were brutal people. This is Egypt's punishment after the Exodus. This. So here is the arrival, here is the prospering, here is the slavery, here is the Exodus, and off to the Promised Land and the conquest of Jericho.
What you're saying is that the pattern of evidence was seeing that which the film is going to be, explaining, and is that in this Middle Bronze Age 1 time period, the 12th dynasty, is when you saw it, and others, that there was this influx coming in to the
Brand
area.
new people coming into the Eastern Delta.
And they were allowed to be there. What BTEC
They were,
told me.
yeah, exactly. They were under the invite of the Pharaoh, just like in the Bible.
So when I was talking with Manfred BTEC, he said to me that these people were given an invitation to be here. In other words, it looked as if they were guests and allowed to settle in that land, matching, once again, the story, the pattern of the story.
And there's your quote. Joseph then settled his father and brothers, giving them the land holdings in Egypt in the very best part of the country, which at this particular point in Genesis it says the region of Ramesses. Other times it says Goshen, just as Pharaoh had ordered. Pharaoh had given them permission to settle in the best part of Egypt, the richest and luscious part. And here it is. This is the land of Goshen, photographed from the Austrian excavation dig house of Manfred BTEC, looking out on the fields where the Israelites lived.
And that was then when I started to realize that we were looking for patterns of evidence. Let's start over and say, where does the pattern begin? And that began, for me as a filmmaker, the approach to take. And I could see that was the scientific approach. And so once we said, let's be free of the dating question, let's just look for the pattern, because of all the information that you know now about the questions about dating. So that gave us the freedom to look for the pattern.
Sure. So let's actually follow this up now, just so you know where Goshen is. It's right there. So it's in the Eastern Delta. It's the nearest part of the fertile delta to Israel and Canaan. Okay? It's on the border of Egypt, effectively, and any Asiatics or Semites coming into Egypt would have settled in the nearest part to their own homeland. That's the area they were given. So what is this land of Goshen that later is called the land of Ramesses? Well, it's located in the Eastern Delta, as we've seen. It's in the nome the Egyptians call Gesem, okay, which is biblical Goshen. And it's by what we call the Pelusiac branch of the River Nile. That's the most furthest east branch of the River Nile. It's on the eastern side of the Pelusiac branch of the River Nile, at a place in this time now, in the Middle Bronze Age, which was known as Avaris. And it later became Pur-Ramesseh. The city was renamed at the time of Ramesses II, Pur-Ramesseh. And I suppose you want to ask that question now. Well, you know, how did that happen? How come the Bible refers to it as Ramses? Well, it's a little bit like the Dutch founding New York. Seems reasonable to you, that statement, doesn't it? Did they found New York?
No.
They founded New Amsterdam. But we're perfectly happy with the idea of them founding New York. Or the Roman 6th Legion comes into England and builds a garrison in the city of York, which New York's named after. And you'll see that in your encyclopedias. But the Romans didn't establish their garrison in York. They founded a garrison in Eboracum, which is what the Romans called it. It was only when the Vikings came along and renamed it Jorvik that we get the name York. But you'll read an encyclopedia that says the 6th Legion founded a garrison at York. So the same thing going on here.
And the thing that we try to show in the film is that underneath the city of Ramesses is this older city of Avaris. And so the challenge is that the name Ramesses actually is the name of a pharaoh, it's the name of a time period, and it's the name of a city that was built at a particular time.
The royal city of the king. He founded this city of Ramses, which you're going to see now, on top of Avaris, the older city. So what the Bible's telling you isn't so much what they built as where they built. So the Israelites built a city at the place where the audience of the time reading the Bible would know to be Ramses, because they did know Ramesses. Ramesses was very famous, the city. They wouldn't have known the ancient name for it, which was Avaris. So here, we're looking down on the very area we're talking about. And this thing here is what we call a tell, or a ruin mound. In fact, it occupied this entire area, but what happened was the farmers, the fellahin in this area, had been ploughing these fields and digging out the ancient site over the centuries, leaving only this last tiny bit of it left here. So this entire area was developed. And another city was found here underneath Cantia. So if I show you now the landscape as it was in ancient times, they used drill cores, about 850 drill cores, to establish that the river, Pelusiac River, the Nile, flowed through here one time. And it divided into two. So the original name of the town, or the village here, was Rowati, which means the mouth of the two ways, where the river Nile split in two, went off to the Mediterranean. And it's on these turtlebacks here, these islands that they established the first settlement. And in the inundation season, of course, all this area would be flooded except for these sand islands that you see here. So they built the village on top of those. So we're in the eastern side, and I'll now show you the settlements. So Avaris, the ancient city, was built predominantly on this island and in this area down here. And later Ramesses, the focus of Ramesses, the city of Ramesses, was here with a royal palace. However, the southern district of Ramesses was built on top of Avaris. So the whole thing was one massive city in the 19th dynasty. But the Israelite city is this one, the earlier one, the Middle Bronze Age one. And here it is. And this is one of the photographs of the excavations a few years ago now, which have collapsed, as you see, and overgrown in this particular part on the main tell. Here's the village of Tel Edaba, which is the name that Tim mentioned earlier. Tel Edaba means the mound of the hyena, and this is the village, basically, which sits on top of the ancient Israelite city. That's what it looked like when it was being excavated in the 1960s, this particular part here, and you can see them digging down and revealing all the important archaeology under this tell. And we managed to reconstruct the actual complex here and the buildings, etc., as we found them from archaeology, from the reports. What you have is the Egyptian enclave with nicely plastered houses. You have the royal palace and the private temple of the king facing the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, and then behind it, this massive Semitic poor area where the Semites lived in this area. They also lived across the river here, but we didn't reconstruct that. But this was the main area of the town, and it turned out to be one of the biggest cities in the ancient world. It was actually more than 1 mile by 1 mile square in terms of its size. Huge population. So, the Middle Bronze IIc city of Avaris, the Middle Bronze Age city, this is the only real candidate for the era and location of the Israelite sojourn as handed down in the biblical tradition. There is no other one. This is when we have the large population of Semites. These people, as you'll see in a little while, live there for a while, they expand, they become slaves. There's some terrible disaster hits the place, they all leave. 40 years later, Jericho's destroyed. If we look at the excavations, I'll now show you what the Israelites of that time looked like. Here they are, the Austrians are excavating. You'll notice that they're digging down less than a couple of feet before they reach the levels, because the farmers have ploughed the rest away above, leaving us just the foundations. Here's a typical pair of Israelite graves. Because there are no stones in this area, because it's the delta, they use mud bricks to build their graves, and they are pits in the ground lined with bricks with a vaulted ceiling. This has been dug away, but this would have been an arch ceiling running across the entire grave here. This one has been dug out, so this one is still to be excavated. This one is open, and I'm going to show you the interior of one of these graves now. You'll notice that the body is lying on its side. Now, Egyptians are not buried on their sides, they're buried on their backs, with their hands down like that. And if you're a pharaoh, like that. And if you're a queen, like that. Okay? But an ordinary person would be buried on his back, usually in a coffin. This guy is on his side with his knees up in what we call the semi-fetal position. This is very much a trait of Semitic peoples from Canaan. This is how they buried the dead. And then along with the dead, they have pottery, which tells of the date, archaeological date of the burial. Now, some of the wealthier tombs had remarkable things in, like, for instance, this magnificent bronze, what we call duckbill axe head. So it's like a duckbill axe because it's like the beak of a duck. It's also called a fenestrated axe because it has these two holes here. But this is a very typical Middle Bronze IIa axe or weapon. And of course, we have typical Canaanite pottery. This is a storage jar from the Middle Bronze IIa. So this is how we date when this burial took place, or when these burials took place. Another thing we find a lot of is tiny little vessels called tel al-Yahudiya ware, about the size, that size, which is usually for ointments, perfumes, etc., for the ladies. It's typical only of this period. Now, if I show you a waterlogged grave here, this is one from a garden tomb that you're going to see in a little while. You see this object here? That is actually a duckbill axe which has not been cleaned up. And this thing, I'm just going to restore that for you. When the archaeologists removed that from the grave and cleaned it up, it turned out to be a magnificent bronze belt. Now this is what a chieftain would wear. With his long gown on, he would have this magnificent bronze belt around here, and he'd be wearing his dagger, his really important dagger, to show his status, his wealth, his power amongst the tribe. And these are the daggers that were found in these graves. Beautiful bronze ribbing, ivory handles, gold rivets to hold the framework together. This is high status material. This is not cheap rubbish. This is really top class Canaanite, Semitic weaponry. And let me just put a little quote in from the Bible. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their daggers are vicious weapons. So even in the Bible, we hear reference to these weapons, these daggers being worn by tribal chieftains, the sons of Jacob. And now, in some of these high status burials of these chieftain figures, the bodies were brought to the grave on a truck, a cart, dragged by 2 donkeys, and then a pit was dug in front of the graves, and the throats of the donkeys were slit, and they were buried in front of the grave. Now that is again typically from Canaan, from Israel, later Israel. We have this type of burial. But what's important is, along with the 2 donkeys were 2 sheep placed in their sacrificial sheep. And the bone analysis by the experts on this has demonstrated that these sheep were from North Syria. They are actually the long-haired Syrian variety, which is exactly where the patriarchs came from. And this is the first time we see them in Egypt. We don't have the sheep, this type of sheep, in Egypt until this era. And we all know that the Israelites were shepherds.
I think that that's one of the things that always continued to be supportive of the story. The pattern was matching once again, the pattern, the pattern, the pattern. And I think that it wasn't just, I was surprised by some of the other, people who've looked in this. They haven't really thought much about the verses and looked at it and said, well, what are the clues you would look for? And once again, the pattern, when you start to add up all the pieces, the pattern really started to make sense to me. Because I didn't want to make a film that was off track. I was trying to understand, something that was valid, that was legitimate. And we had numerous other scholars that have looked at this and said, yes, this matches the story of the time.
But you asked Beat at the question, what were these people like? And he told you they were shepherds.
Yes.
And yet he still didn't identify them as the Israelites.
Right. He called did he say proto-Israelites?
Well, no, he doesn't use that word. Oh, no, he wouldn't use that word. So they can't see the wood for the trees. It's essentially what he's saying. Mm-hmm. Now, if I'll move on, because we're getting a little bit time compressed here. So let's move on to Joseph, shall we? This is the historical events behind the tradition of the sojourn. Well, just before the time when I placed Joseph's arrival, we start to see Semites coming into Egypt. This is from Beni Hassan, and they are wearing, yes, you've got it, multicolored coats. This is the only time in Egyptian history we have visual art of Semitic peoples entering Egypt wearing this type of colored coat. In the New Kingdom, when you have the standard chronology, they wear white coats with trim on their sleeves and around their necks. They don't wear multicolored coats. And here is the leader of the brigade coming in, the 37 people. I would call them Midianites. His name is Abishah, and he's called a Hyksos, or a ruler of the foreign countries, and he's got a fabulous coat, much better than the rest of the men of the tribe. So status is all important here. You get the best coat if you're the leader. This is the time of 2 pharaohs, Senusret III and Amenemhat III, who were co-regents. This is the father, this is the son. What's noticed about these 2 is how miserable they are. These are the only 2 pharaohs in Egyptian history which look like this. Look at the way the mouth is turned down. Look at the furrows here. Look how the ears are turned, big ears are turned round at right angles. Now, in visual art, an art historian will tell you that what this reflects is concern on the part of the Pharaoh for his people. It's not smiley, smiley pharaohs here. This is pharaohs who are worried, who are concerned for Egypt, showing concern for it, and it's the only time we see this. And there's a reason for it. This is the Fayum Basin, which we'll come back to in a minute. Great Lake, Birkat Karun. But this is a quote from the Bible. Genesis 41, 17-21. So Pharaoh told Joseph, "In my dream there I was standing on the bank of the river Nile, when 7 fat cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and began to feed amongst the rushes. And then 7 more cows came up behind them, starved, very wretched and lean. I have never seen such poor cows in all Egypt. The lean and wretched cows devoured the 7 fat cows, but when they had devoured them, it was impossible to tell, for they looked as wretched as ever." That's Pharaoh's dream. That's what Joseph was tasked to interpret. Now, what's important here, and what's not mentioned in the Bible, is that these cows came up out of the Nile. That's not explained in the Bible. But from this connection we've made now between the story of Joseph and Egyptian history and archaeology, we can explain the reason now for the cause of the famine. Now, we all know about Nile inundations. Every year in the late spring, the Nile floods its banks. Waters come down the river Nile from Ethiopia, from the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and they flood the Egyptian plain up to the desert plateau. And this happens regularly every year. But the level that it comes to is very crucial to whether or not Egypt prospers or whether it starves. And what we have down in Upper Egypt, this is Nubia here, there's Abu Simbel, there's Aswan. We come right the way down here to the border of Egypt in this period before we get to the land of Cush, which is in Sudan. We have 2 forts either side of a gorge. One is called Semna and the other one is called Kuma. Here's an aerial photograph of those 2 forts, there and there. And what happened was, in this particular period, in the reign of Amenemhet III, they started to record the heights of the Nile in the inundation, year by year. First time it had happened, they hadn't done it before. And we believe what it was an early warning system to tell people further north how high the flood was going to be. And if I show you a very complicated chart, I'll explain it very quickly. This is the low level of the river for most of the year. This is the standard flood level in modern times. That means the last 2,000 years here. But in this time, in the reign of Amenemhat, we see these records here, and they tell us that the flood jumped from 12 meters up to around 18 meters in year 3 of the king. And then suddenly, a few years later, it zooms up to 21 meters. So we have a massive increase in water coming into the Nile. This is 4 times the typical average flood, 4 times the quantity. So this is your 7 years of plenty, and that is your 7 years of famine. Plenty because increased water here to this perfect level means more harvest because you can expose more areas to water inundation and the fertile silt. Here, destruction, total destruction. Villages wiped out, cattle killed, drowned, sheep drowned. And the important thing is, if this land is flooded with 4 times the water, it takes 4 times as long for the water to dissipate out to the Mediterranean. So you can't plant your crops. Because when it comes for the end of the season, when you need to plant your seed in the ground is waterlogged. And if it happens year after year after year after year, you get a famine. That's why the cows came out of the river Nile in Pharaoh's dream. The Nile is the cause of both the plenty and the famine. This is the water conditions that they would have been confronted with at the time of planting. So in Genesis 45:6, for this is the 2nd year of the famine. There has been famine in the country, and there are still 5 years to come without ploughing or harvest. Now, if the famine had been caused by a drought, that would not stop ploughing. The only thing that stops ploughing is water. So what does Joseph do about it? Well, he's a genius, this man. This is the the great Fayum Lake, and this is what it looks like today. It's called Birket Karun. This is a huge lake. In the time of Joseph and Pharaoh Amenemhat, it was this size. Absolutely enormous. Why did it grow so big? Well, because of this canal that was dug from the Nile to siphon off 50% of the floodwater into this sump, to take away the potential for disaster further north. So he devised this canal, or somebody devised this canal, to divert 50% of the water. King Amenemhat was so pleased with this operation, he actually built his pyramid right on this canal at Tawara. He regarded this as the most important thing that had been achieved in his reign. And the name of the canal? Bar Yosef, the waterway of Joseph.
With God's help, Joseph was able to save Egypt by warning of a coming calamity. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of terrible famine. Pharaoh is so impressed that he puts Joseph in charge of preparing for the famine and makes him second in command over the entire country.
He managed to achieve this by foretelling or explaining the dreams of Pharaoh about cattle coming out of the water of the Nile. As first of all 7 fat cows, and then 7 lean cows come out and devour the fat cows. It's an extraordinary story. But the clue here is that these cows are coming out of the Nile. It's the Nile itself which is the cause of both the plenty and the famine.
If David's interpretation is right, then the regulation of the Nile may have been key in planning for the coming famine.
Is there any indication of famines in Egypt? That's what I'm interested in.
Of course there is, in many different periods. But there's one key period when we get this massive famine, which lasts about 7 to 10 years. And it's the time of the end of the 12th Dynasty, in the reign of Amenemhat III. He's the pharaoh of this big famine. And it's caused by water, believe it or not, excess water. When the Nile floods every year, it brings down water from Ethiopia, extra water. But at this particular period, it's 4 times the amount of water. What that does is it means that your cattle are drowning, your fields are flooded, houses are swept away, and there's no time to actually plant the crops because the water's still lying on the fields for months on end. Mm-hmm. So you end up in a situation where you can't plant your crops, and therefore you can't harvest the crops 3 months later. Well, and that results in famine.
According to the biblical text, though, it said this famine had spread all the way to the land of the Bible, to where Jacob was, and where Joseph's family was. Mm-hmm. That's why Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to get grain.
But famine in one area may be caused by something different to another area. In Egypt, it might have been excess water. In the north, in the area we call the Holy Land, it might have been too much sun, too much dryness, desiccation. Mm-hmm. So in one area, you may be getting a cause of famine, which is excess water flooding the fields, preventing harvests. And in the other area, it may be the fact there's no food because the sun has killed all the plants.
Mm-hmm. According to the text, though, it states that Joseph made preparations.
Yeah.
Do you find anything similar to that in Egypt?
You do, because of course there's 7 years of plenty which come before the 7 years of famine. And what we see in Egypt by way of preparation is the building of grain stores. We have this new administration that sets up called the Department of the People's Giving, where the people grow their crops and bring them to government storehouses where they're kept, and then apparently, when in times of crisis, the food is then redistributed back to the people. This Department of the People's Giving is exactly like the Joseph story.
I understand there's an interesting canal that actually has a similar association.
That's right. There's a canal or a cutting, a waterway that connects the Nile to the Fayum Basin. This is a large lake area, which has the name Bar Yosef, which means the waterway of Joseph. And this goes back thousands of years as far as we can tell.
Fascinating. So there's actually a canal that has the very name of Joseph. Why do you think that canal has that name?
Because I think he made it. I think it was under his instructions as vizier of Egypt that canal was cut. And it was cut to divert half the water from the Nile into the Fayum Basin to protect the Nile Delta and the capital from excessive flooding.
So what you're suggesting is that Joseph knew about these floods that would wipe out the cropland, and he prepared by creating a canal to siphon off the water.
Reduce the water by half and you get back to the land of plenty again. If all the water comes down, then you have this disaster. But if you reduce it by half by diverting half the water, you then get back to the situation where the water levels are just right for growing crops.
Is that canal still, I mean, can you see it today?
It's still in use today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Joseph gathers up all the grain during the 7 years of plenty in Egypt. He gathered as much as the sand of the sea. And then the famine comes to the entire region, and only Egypt has bread. So everyone comes to Joseph for what they need for survival. When their money runs out, they sold their animals. When that ran out, they sold their land, and eventually they sold themselves. So Pharaoh, by the end of the 7 years, owns everything in Egypt.
If you examine Joseph's famine policy, you'll see he was very astute. He didn't simply give the grain away as some kind of a giant welfare program. He sold the grain. And so the people had to buy the grain. And when their money was gone, they had to bring their animals. And when they went through the animals, then they had to sell their property. And so Joseph, slowly, over those 7 years, accumulated all the wealth of Egypt. But there's a very significant exception given there in the Bible. The temples were not subjected to this plan of Joseph's, and they were given grain. And the temple system was very strong in ancient Egypt, and so it's understandable why that exception was made. But otherwise, the wealth of Egypt came into Joseph, which meant that it came to Pharaoh, because Joseph was sort of the chief steward, you might say, for Pharaoh. He was in charge of Pharaoh's house, the steward of Pharaoh's household, which meant all of his estates and property and so on. And so when we look at Egyptian history, we find something very significant happen at this exact time in Egyptian history. Prior to this time, Egypt was divided up into areas called nomes, kind of like districts all over the country. This continued after Joseph's time as well. But prior to the time of Joseph, the leaders of these nomes, nomarchs they were called, had tremendous wealth and tremendous power. We get to a point in Egyptian history when suddenly that all changes and all the wealth is concentrated with the Pharaoh. What on earth happened here? If you read the Egyptian history books, there is no explanation for it. They don't know what happened, how it happened. I mean, this was a tremendous social, economic change in Egypt, a very conservative country which does not change easily. But suddenly the whole thing is turned upside down. Instead of the nomarchs having all this power and authority and wealth, it's all concentrated with the Pharaoh. Well, we have the answer in the Bible, and it's Joseph's famine policy, and he brings the wealth into Pharaoh, and it fits exactly with Egyptian history. That's just one example of how Egyptian history and culture and so on fits with the biblical story.
So, our topic today for certain is an attempt to answer this question. Is there compelling evidence of Israelite sojourn in Egypt that the Bible talks about as taking place over a period of 430 years? And the answer, I'm convinced, is absolutely yes. And that's what I'm here tonight to attempt to persuade you of when you look at the evidence. So, a couple introductory matters I want to quickly cover. First, I'm not going to prove to you, or attempt to prove to you, the chronological framework by which my understanding of ancient history hinges. I'm going to assume it to be true. If I had more time, more hours with you, I would do that. I would spend time attempting to prove that to you, passage by passage with Israelite history, and then looking at the evidence from Egyptology, including ancient historical Egyptian records that very carefully date events that take place, some of which are tied into what we call astronomical events, meaning events that are recorded that take into account something that happened in the heavens with astronomy. So I can't provide that framework for you. I'm assuming it to be true, but don't think that I can't attempt to prove it to you. I hope that's clear. 1 Kings 6:1, of course, is the hub. It's the central text in all of the Hebrew Bible for establishing the chronology. And really, if you don't establish a sound and correct chronological framework, you really have very little chance of correctly identifying events that take place in the ancient world with what you read about in the Bible, if the Bible does address those ancient events. All right, next, as far as tools that can help you, as Dr. McPherson mentioned, I have 7 published articles now, the most recent one being just a few weeks ago that published, on my academia.edu webpage. Now, I don't know how many of you have Facebook, but I have great news for you. You can throw away your Facebook because the real Facebook is academia.edu. Because there you can get amazing scholarship from scholars all around the world in pretty much any field that you want to study. And I've downloaded literally hundreds, if not over 1,000, I've downloaded hundreds of articles that I've read, that I've benefited from, that have helped my scholarship, and actually my past studies as a student as well. So go to academia.edu if you're interested. All you have to do is Google academia.edu, my name, and it will take you to my page. You may have to become a member to download anything, my articles or anything else that you would want to pull off of there. If that's the case, do it. There's no obligation. You can do it for free. There's also a premium service that you pay, I don't know, $10 a month or something for, that you can do. I don't do that. I just have the free version. But I encourage you to do that, not only for my work, but for the work of many scholars around the world whose work you should be reading and can be reading. So I want to point out a couple, 2 or 3 sources that will tie together what I'm talking to you about tonight. First is one of my recent articles, a 2019 article in the Near Eastern Archaeological Society Bulletin, called Determining the Precise Length of the Israelite Sojourn in Egypt. And there's if you don't know it, there's a dispute about this, and this article represents, it's funny, I was told that this is a really long article by one young scholar. It presents the most thorough discussion of this topic that I know of that's in print anywhere. So you will want to consult that if that's an important issue. And certainly it hinges upon, or all I'm going to talk about tonight hinges upon being correct that it's 430 years, as Exodus 12:40 and 41 says, to the very day. Second, my most recent article, I'm sorry, no, that's the last. Second is the book that is just about to publish. Hopefully it will be out by the end of the summer or early fall. This is my second book. It's just as, if not more, controversial than my first book, which was, when it came out, the most controversial book in the world of ancient Near Eastern studies. This is called Origin of the Hebrews, New Evidence for Israelites in Egypt from Joseph to the Exodus. And that is essentially, in crystallized form, what I want to share with you tonight. Then, as kind of an extra that's not really applicable to what I talk about tonight, but if you're interested in what's called the United Monarchy, which is the Israelite monarchy before they split into 2 kingdoms, right? We have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Before that split, there's the United Kingdom. Scholars argue against the historicity of this kingdom vehemently, and have been doing so since at least the 1980s. So this is one of the hot-button topics in universities all around the world that really becomes a focal point for criticism of the Bible and biblical historicity. So the Exodus and the Israelites in Egypt for 430 years, that's probably the area of greatest attack, and second would be this United Monarchy. So I wrote an article on a site called Kirbeit Kayafa, and I tried to solve the question of whether or not the site of Kirbeit Kayafa is connected to King Saul or to King David or to both kings. So that's a really important article. It was a lot of fun to write this. It's newly hot off the press, and I encourage you to read it. Again, it's downloadable for free on my academy.edu webpage. All right, let's get into tonight's fun. We want to start with a look at the biblical text and a site plan for the site that I'm 100% convinced is what we read about in the Bible as the place where Jacob and his family settled when they moved down from Canaan into Egypt. In the Bible, it's referred to as Ramses. That's the site of Avaris. So here's what it says in Genesis 47:11. Now Joseph settled his father and his brothers, and he gave them property in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land. And here it is, in the land of Manasseh, just as that which Pharaoh had commanded. Now, there's a problem here. First of all, many of us in this room, I don't know if you're included, I'm included in this group, are committed to what's called an early Exodus view, which means that the Israelites left Egypt in the middle of the 15th century BC, and specifically I would say 1446 BC, and one of my articles actually argues for the exact day that it takes place, and that's in my book that's just about to publish as well, a more expanded and updated version of that. So that being the case, look at my note there. Ramses II in his regnal years, and so if you see dates next to a king's name, these are not his birth and death dates, these are his regnal years, when he reigned. And his reign was from 1290 to 1223. You can see it's an extremely extensive or long reign. That Ramses II built the city of Per-Ramesses as his capital city. Does this require a 13th century BC Exodus date? And certainly if your name is Cecil B. DeMille or Walt Disney, you would say yes, it requires a 13th century Exodus date. But I would beg to differ, and a number of other Christian scholars would beg to differ with this. So I want to take your attention to one of the most reliable sources today on planet Earth. Let's all say it together. Wikipedia. Yes. There is actually good that can be found on Wikipedia, and I was so excited to see this. I always like to share what you find. And it's on the site of Kantir. Kantir is the Arabic name for the site of Ramesses, Per-Ramesses, what Ramses II founded and built and made his capital sometime in the 13th century BC. And most late Exodus advocates don't even have an exact year that they settle on. Well, you should have an exact year because the Bible is very exact about its chronology. So Kantir is the name of that site, right? And look what's in the red box. I don't know if you can read this. I'll read it for you. It's kind of small. I have to have my glasses to see it nowadays. The ancient site of Avaris is located around 2 kilometers south of Kantir. And I would correct that to southeast of Kantir. This was the older city in the area. That is, Avaris was the older city. Later on, and here's the point, later on, Avaris was absorbed by Ramesses. Wikipedia is exactly right. It was absorbed. It all became part of the same city. Late Exodus advocates will not tell you that this is the case. They hide that information from you if they know it themselves. Why? Because the claim that the Exodus must have happened in the 13th century BC is primarily based on this text and Exodus 1:11, which is a parallel passage, identifying Ramesses as the site where the Israelites settled. That's their main argument. But that argument dissipates if it's all one site. How can this work? Well, I'm here to show you how this can work. So first of all, we have to look at where Avaris is, and I'm going to point to this with my cursor. So my cursor is pointing to this red dot in what's called the Eastern Nile Delta, and the delta, of course, represents a triangular-shaped object that essentially is a way of expressing what the delta looked like. And so right in this Eastern Nile Delta is the site of Avaris. Well, an inscription was found on a shrine door dating to the 20th Dynasty of Egypt. That is, the 1100s or the 1000s BC. And this inscription, this the shrine door is now in the Pushkin Museum, which I don't know if you're familiar with this, but is in the country of Russia, where I lived for 10 years. And it mentions a certain kind of Egyptian priest called a Wab priest. And it says that he was a Wab priest of the god Amun. That's one of the gods in Egypt's pantheon of gods. It's one of the solar deities, who was located at the harbor of Avaris. So the inscription says, in, let's say, 1150 BC, or whatever year we pick, 1100 BC, it says, the priest was standing at the harbor in Avaris. Was he? Could he have been? Well, let's look more closely. So here's kind of a mid-range view of Avaris as you see it in relation to the Mediterranean Sea. It's located in this area. So the southwest if I didn't mention that before, southwest is what I wanted to say, of Kantir or Paramesses. That's traditional Avaris. That's where the Egyptians first settled, and then later these Asiatics that I'm suggesting we connect to the Israelites, they settled there as well. But here is Kantir. And then you can see that the Nile River branches off into a number of tributaries and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And along this area around Avaris, we call this the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. And there, of course, is a very important and famous road that essentially ends at Avaris. And if you're taking it into Asia, for example, you take this road like this. Follow that all the way. It's going to start hugging the Mediterranean Sea coast more or less, and it's going to work its way around that corner, that rounded end of the Mediterranean Sea, and go up into Asia, into the place we call the Levant. And of course, the Levant is the name for ancient Israel, and which used to be Canaan before that, ancient Phoenicia, and ancient Syria. All that area is the Levant. There's the northern Levant and the southern Levant. Israel, of course, is known as the southern Levant. So this is the road that would take you there. All right, now let's really get down to business here. This is more of a blow-up of this area. We see the Pelusiac Nile, branch of the Nile that's flowing here upward in the picture, and then kind of makes a diagonal right turn. And so all of this is the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. And all of this area here down to the lower left, that's traditional older Avaris. Paramesses is the area up in the upper right in the image. So the Wab priest would have been somewhere up here in the residential area of Paramesses, and he worked his way downhill, probably slightly, to the coast, and all of a sudden he comes upon this bulge right here, which is a harbor. That's where ships would dock in the Ramesside period. But that's not the harbor of traditional Avaris. Everyone who understands the New Kingdom in Egypt's history knows that Avaris's harbor, and actually they had two, but their main harbor was this one right here in the middle of this otherwise plot of land that's in white. So this area in the very middle of the photo almost is Avaris's harbor. But the priest says, I'm at Avaris's harbor. Why does he say that when instead he would have been here? Because this, Avaris's harbor, was abandoned at the time. He had no reason to go there. There weren't ships coming in and out. There weren't places to buy food. There weren't places to speak with people. It's empty. It's a ghost town kind of a harbor. It's probably in disrepute by this time. So he goes to this harbor and he calls it the harbor of Avaris. You know what that tells us? That the ancient Egyptians themselves viewed the city of Paramesses as Avaris. It's part of the overall city of Avaris. So, when the biblical text refers to Ramesses, it's not confined to Paramesses of the 13th dynasty and afterward. No, because to the Egyptians, it's all one site. So the question then comes, and that's the old harbor there to the left. The question comes as to what about the identification of this name Paramesses? How do we account for that? One quick note for you. I have a phasing scheme right here for you. It's really in small detail. You probably can't see it very well. I haven't put it up on my academia.edu webpage yet. I eventually will. It is one of the important plates in my book that's about to come out, and it essentially attempts to identify certain places in Avaris and lines up time periods with people and with events and so forth, and gives you the right chronological framework. So be looking out for that in the future, if in my book, if not somewhere else. Well, there are two main areas in that phasing scheme that we want to look at. One is what's called F1, capital F, capital 1, or Roman numeral 1. It's mainly all of this area over here. That's area F1, lower left in the photo. And then up here near the top is area R1. This is going to become important to us. And this rectangular black object here is a temple that was built by the Egyptians before the Israelites settled at the site. That was a temple that was built to worship the founder of the 12th dynasty. His name was Amenemhat the first. So the temple was built to worship a deceased king. And if you're not familiar with this, this is very common in the ancient world. Happened all the time. The Greco-Macedonians did it, the Romans did it, everybody did it. And it was done much earlier. So in this phasing scheme, R1 is this column here, F1 is this column here, and the time when the Israelites settle is in the Middle Kingdom. It's in the 12th dynasty, and there's a Roman numeral 12 on the lower left part of the grid that shows you that it's the 12th dynasty. Let's see, right here, D2 and D1, these are the two main strata. A stratum is a level, an archaeological level that we're convinced is of a certain time period in an ancient site, right? And there's one stratum. If you have two or more, it's strata. So these two strata are very important because the Asiatics, who I'm claiming are Israelites, settle during stratum D2 in area F1, which is equivalent to what's called phase H. So archaeologists often assign a phase to a certain stratum. So I could either be saying phase H or stratum D2. It's essentially the same thing. Then stratum D1, which is a long stratum, is the equivalent of G4, if you're looking in terms of phasing. So those designations will come up a little bit later. But yeah, let's see. There's something missing here. Okay, I don't see the slide here. Maybe I'll come to it, but just in case I don't come to it, maybe I axed it out without intending to. Let's talk quickly about the reason why Ramesses is written in the biblical text. There's an article that came out in 2001 in JETS. It's called the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society by a scholar named Michael Grisanti. He's a professor at the Master's Seminary in Southern California. That's where I graduated. He was there for a few years in my final years as a student. He's still there. It's a groundbreaking article on a topic called textual updating that happens not with the Greek New Testament at all, but in very rare instances happens with the Hebrew Bible, where something in the text was updated by a later scribe. Doesn't mean the scribe ruined things. It doesn't mean the scribe was correcting a mistake, but updating something, adding something, or making something understandable but equivalent at the same time. One example of this is the city of Dan that's mentioned in the Pentateuch, which really wasn't identifiable yet as the city of Dan during Moses' lifetime. How could Moses refer to a site called Dan when there is no Dan yet there? And that's later in their history. Well, it's because a later scribe came in and put the word Dan there and made it understandable. Same goes with Ur of the Chaldeans, the site of Ur where Abraham was from, Abram. That wasn't Chaldean until about the 10th century BC. There were no Chaldeans there in southern Mesopotamia. That's a much later phenomenon. But of course, Abraham dates to the late 3rd millennium BC. There was a site of Ur, but it didn't belong to Chaldeans. So a later scribe came in and updated the text so that the readers of the day, folks, could understand where and what this city was, so that it could make sense. So I'd encourage you to read his article. it's extremely, I think, important in helping us to understand certain things in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament. And another example is the end of chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, which documents for us Moses' death and what happens long after his death. And that's included in Deuteronomy 34. It's not that there was some rogue bad guy scribe out there who was dirtying up the Pentateuch. No. He was writing the ending to the story under divine guidance to add things that we wouldn't have known from Moses himself. That's not bad or wrong. And it doesn't mean Moses isn't the author of the Pentateuch. He is. But this is a very small sliver where a scribe came along in the 1,000-year period, roughly, in which Hebrew scribes wrote the Hebrew Bible. It was of a different literary form, the Hebrew Bible, than the New Testament. For the New Testament, you write an epistle, it's done. There's no adding, subtracting, changing, nothing. You write a gospel, it's done. It's all over. But the Hebrew Bible was more fluid over that period of 1,000 years. And these scribal updates, done very rarely, not often, were done to improve the understanding for the reader. That being the case, no doubt in my mind, that added to the list of what Michael Grisanti calls these scribal updates is the site name for the city where Jacob settled his family. Because in Moses' day, it wasn't even called Avaris anymore. There was a new name for the city. That new name was Peru-Nefer, which means pleasant journey. It's what you say, it's like bon voyage, right? When you leave a certain place and you're going somewhere else. And that's the name of the city in all of the documents of the middle of the 18th dynasty when Moses was alive. And near the end of the 18th dynasty, the usage of that name for the site, it went out of existence when, there was an abandonment of the site immediately after the Egyptian army died in the Sea of Reeds. But then after that, there was the name Peru-Nefer went out of use altogether. So nobody in subsequent generations would know Peru-Nefer, right? If you say pleasant journey, they wouldn't know what the site is. And certainly in the probably in the period of the judges, maybe the early monarchy, the scribes look at this and they say, we know that our readers are not going to understand Peru-Nefer. Let's update it to the modern understanding, which is Per-Ramesses, or Ramses, as is written in our Bibles. So this update was done not to tamper with the Bible, but to help people's understanding of it, right? It's a good thing they did, not a bad thing they did. And for that reason, that scribal update helped that generation of readers and potentially later readers as well. So that's how to explain why Ramses is in the text when it didn't exist as Ramses until the 13th century BC. All right, let's look at some important chronological pegs for what we're going to talk about tonight. In 1885 BC, I suggest to you that Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, or actually pair of dreams. And then, of course, he was elevated immediately after. In 1878, that is when we have two things going on in the same year. There's a shift in the reigns, who's on the throne in Egypt, from Sesostris II to Sesostris III. The second event that happens that year is a switch, oddly enough, in that same year, from the 7 years of abundance to the 7 years of famine. So these events happen in the same year. So we can affectionately refer to Sesostris II as the abundance Pharaoh, and Sesostris III as the famine Pharaoh. So remember that, write that down on a piece of paper, in your mind, on your notepad, on your iPad, whatever. Then 1876, that's the important critical peg in biblical chronology, where we go 430 years back from the Exodus, which was in 1446, and it takes us to 1876, the year that Jacob entered Egypt with his family. Very important. And we're already in the midst. We're 2 years into the famine when that happens, right? Then 1859 is the year Jacob died, because the Bible says very clearly that Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt before he died. So 1859, Jacob dies. And another important event happens. Sesostris III, the what Pharaoh? Famine Pharaoh. Very good, some of you. The Famine Pharaoh. He brought his son, Amenemhat III, onto the throne. And there was what we call a co-regency. 2 rulers at the same time. Now, those of you in my generation, you know what's going on here. This is golf game time. He's going to go into semi-retirement, Sesostris III, and his son, make the son do all of the hard work of the daily decisions in Egypt. I don't want to mess with that anymore. I want to get under par, right? So he goes and enjoys semi-retirement in 1859 BC. 1805, that's the year that Joseph dies. Okay, so there we are. Sesostris II, abundance Pharaoh. Sesostris III, famine Pharaoh. Amenemhat III, the Pharaoh whose rule began in the year of Jacob's death. That becomes very important to us because he's interconnected with the characters of the Bible of this generation. Now we're going to look at the site that I'm claiming is where Jacob settled. Remember, that's Avaris. We're going to look at the first Asiatic settlement there, phase of settlement there. That's stratum D2. If you remember, that's phase H in the phasing record. And that I'm connecting with the lifetime of Jacob. And later we'll be looking at stratum D1. It's the second Asiatic level at Avaris. And I connect that to the grandsons, 2 grandsons of Jacob, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh. So let's add a couple dates. 1859 we know about. 1842, that's the earliest attested Proto-Consonantal Hebrew letter on an inscription. Remember D1 we're going to look at now. This is the level that I'm connecting to Ephraim and Manasseh. There's a relevant biblical passage here in Genesis 47. It says, "So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen, and they acquired possessions in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. Jacob lived in the land 17 years. Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, 'Take note, your father is sick.' So he, Joseph, took his 2 sons, his oldest, Manasseh, the older of the 2, and Ephraim with him." That's what we're highlighting. "When it was told to Jacob, 'Look, your son Joseph has come to you,' Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed." Genesis 48. Let's skip down. "Now your 2 sons," right? Jacob speaking to Joseph, "your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine." This, folks, is pure and simple theft. Jacob was stealing the 2 oldest sons of Joseph and taking them for himself and planting them among Joseph's brothers in the land of Goshen at Avaris for a purpose. Why? Because Jacob was about to die, and he knew the only way for his sons and their families to survive is to have some kind of connection to Egypt. Who can connect them to Egypt, right? They walk up to Jacob, and he can probably barely see, right? But he notices these guys are Egyptian. They're not Asiatic, they're Egyptian. They know Egyptian language, they know Egyptian culture, they know Egyptian religion. They know everything about Egypt because they were raised in Egypt, and they were raised as the sons of the vizier. Beautiful plan. They can help their uncles survive. And that's exactly what they did. This is one of the most important moments in biblical history. They will be called, but as for your offspring that have been born after them, they will be yours. So Jacob allowed the other sons of Joseph to be his. All right, so I'm suggesting to you that the house of Ephraim and Manasseh is in this black area in what's called Area F1 at Avaris. Here it is on the far left, and now it's a red asterisk that's near it, and that's where this massive building was built. And here it is. It took the archaeologists over 4 decades, folks, to excavate all of this, and they didn't even excavate the entire structure. Room after room after room. Somebody was loaded with money. When they were just about when they were just about done with no, I'm sorry. Let's skip that. All right. So all of this represents the construction of people with. When the archaeologists had started to construct all of this area, they thought of something that this has to be a palace. Why? Because it is so elaborate and it just goes on room after room after room. But what is it that you have to have in a palace for it to be a palace? Throne room, exactly. No throne room, no throne, no palace. So how do you call it a palace when there's no throne room? I want to show you the tomb of D. Sobek Emchat, the man that I'm connecting to Ephraim. So there's this tomb here. It dates to stratum D1. That's the second occupational phase. I'm saying that this is I'll tell you ahead, I'm reading the end of the book for you. This is Ephraim's tomb, D. Sobek Emchat. And so here's a kind of a blow-up of his tomb. You can see it's this blue. And then here is a closer image with the collapsed roofing superstructure on top of it. You can see that there's a donkey burial here. There's a goat burial here, a donkey burial here. So whoever died and was buried here was really connected to his animals. And of course, donkeys are not Egyptian animals at this time. This has to be an Asiatic. So when you remove the superstructure and you look at the contents in the tombs that are here, plural tombs, within the greater tomb, the one that's in the upper left on our screen, right here in red, that's the tomb of the male owner of this tomb. His name is D. Sobek Emchat. And that's a blow-up of a drawing of his bones. So you're looking at a drawing of the bones of Joseph's son, Ephraim, right here. And among all of these, the bones, there were grave goods. And there were faience beads. There was a golden bracelet. There was a silver bracelet. There was an alabaster jar. There was a socketed javelin head that was silver or bronze. So these are the things of a person who has a lot of money. The average Asiatic doesn't have a lot of money. Now the sons of Joseph, the vizier, they're loaded. They can get whatever they want. So what we want to focus on is right here, number 3. That's this amethyst scarab and golden ring. Isn't this beautiful, this purple amethyst? And there's an inscription right here. So when you look at the hieroglyphs here and you see there's a part that's missing at the top, that can be reconstructed. And it can be reconstructed because the virtual exact, the mirror image of this is from an inscription down in the mines in Sinai. Right? Remember Serbit el-Khadim, one of the 2 sites where they would go and extract turquoise? And there it says, Sen en cheka en retchenu chebederem. Doesn't that bless you? That's son of the ruler of Retchenu. Retchenu is the Egyptian name for the Levant. Somebody who came from the Levant. And then it gives his name Chebederem. And the M is actually optional. It could be Chebeded, could be Chebederem. So because of what's here, we know to reconstruct this part so that the scarab from that rich person at Avaris, we know that we can reconstruct his name to D. Sobek Emchat, ruler of Retchenu. And it means, and archaeologists all agree with this, it means that he is the ruler of the city of Avaris. Now think about this for a minute. He claims to be the ruler of Avaris. Well, we already saw that decades ago that this high person, the son of Sobek that I'm saying is Joseph, he appointed, he was the ruler of the city of Avaris. So think about this. As Joseph would age and Ephraim would grow and become greater in stature, and Joseph would move towards semi-retirement, what would Joseph do? Whom would he appoint as the ruler of the city of Avaris? Who better than the son who received the birthright, Ephraim? So Ephraim can be this D. Sobek Emchat. Di Sobek Emchat means he who was appointed by Sobek Emchat. All right, Chebeded. You know what his name means? This is really fascinating. Chebeded means he who was disfavored. He who was disfavored. What happened to Manasseh when the blessing was given to Ephraim, his brother, and not to him? Favor was taken away from Manasseh. The only time in Egypt's entire history when anyone was ever called Chebeded, and this is a perfect passive participle in Middle Egyptian, the only time is here with this Chebeded guy, he who was disfavored. No one else was ever called that we know of in Egyptian history. And I've checked all the books. Nobody. He was disfavored. Now we're back to the Serabit el-Khadim mines. There you see the mines. There's the stela here. And so we have all of these stelae. And here's one that we already saw, Sinai 112. We looked at this. And this gives the name of this guy here who's an attendant. It's Kekbi. And the guy sitting on the donkey is Chebeded. He was disfavored. And there's this young boy here that's in front of the donkey. And every time Chebeded goes down for a new expedition, he depicts this boy on our right as taller and taller and taller and taller. And only once does he name him. And it's in this inscription. And do you know what he names this? You see him? You see how much taller he is now? Here he is in relation to the donkey. This was some years earlier. He's shorter. Now he's taller, and here it gives his name. In good Middle Egyptian, that's Shechem. Shechem. Well, if you were to go to Joshua 17:2, you would find the names of Manasseh's children. It's the only place in the Bible you'll find it. One of his sons is named Shechem, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Shechem. All it's different is a vowel, and that means nothing. Because Shechem, the Hebrew version, actually may be wrong. It may have been Shechem originally. So this boy who's in front of the donkey in all these pictures, he's named Shechem, which is the name of Manasseh's son, he who was disfavored. And that's Chebeded. And Chebeded, his title is brother of the ruler of Rechenu. Then who is the ruler of Rechenu? That's his brother, Ephraim. And Ephraim's name is Di Sobek Emchat. So who is Sobek Emchat? And with our last moments, we get into our final slideshow. Who is Sobek Emchat? Who's the guy who appointed Di Sobek Emchat as the the ruler or mayor of the city? Well, we go to Dashur. It's this site right here, and this is the pyramid of Sesostris III, who's the what pharaoh? Famine Pharaoh. So Joseph would have overlapped in his official viziership during the reign of Sesostris II and Sesostris III, meaning when Sesostris III started his reign, his first vizier had to be Joseph. Watch this. There is a drawing of his pyramid. Here are the royal pyramids around it. Here is the court. So all of these pyramids are enclosed because it's royalty. And then to the lower right is a set of 3 vizierial mastabas. These are burial tombs. Very nice, very elaborate burial tombs of viziers. And the first one, the largest one, every Egyptologist who has studied the site said that had to be Sesostris III's first vizier. Guess, folks, what his name is? There it is, right there. Sobek Emchat. Oh my goodness. Sobek Emchat, the first vizier of Sesostris III, appointed Di Sobek Emchat, he whom Sobek Emchat appointed as the mayor of Avaris, the same city that Sa Sobek, son of Sobek, was the controller of before. So what would have happened? Joseph would have had 2 early names, Sa Sobek and Horamchat. And then later in time, those 2 conflate into one. And if you conflate them, it becomes Sobek is at the forefront. So you're looking at a person who is connected to the life-giving water of the Nile and puts that God at the forefront. That's Joseph also. And the final thing we'll look at is this mastaba. I'm sorry, this funerary inscription. So this inscription was found not in Sobekemkhat's mastaba. And by the way, the French excavators about a century ago, more than a century ago now, who excavated the site of Dashur and excavated the mastabas there, when they excavated the mastaba of Sobekemkhat, guess what they found? That the body was robbed out in antiquity. What happened to Joseph when he died? Yeah. He was buried but taken back and buried finally, conclusively, in Canaan. It fits perfectly. Look at this title. So it gives some of his titles here, and then we come to this one in the, it's dark blue for me, and here it is, controller of the entire land. Controller of the entire land. What does it say in Genesis 41:41? That's the role, one of the roles that Pharaoh gave to Joseph. He gave him control of the entire land of Egypt. And this is so unprecedented in Egyptian history, folks, that the world's foremost authority on Middle Kingdom titles said that this was a mistake that needed to be corrected. It's a mistake. He changed the translation to something else because nobody could be controller of the entire land. Only the king would be the controller of the entire land. But Joseph received that title, and so does this guy, Sobekemkhat. Isn't this amazing? Wow. God has pieced all this together for us to see. Why? So that we would know he's done all these things that the Bible says that he did in ancient history. Let's rejoice together because he is the true and living God, and his word will be validated throughout history and eternity. Amen? Amen. Thank you.
Now I believe we have enough evidence to safely make the assumption that Joseph could have lived in the Middle Kingdom of the 12th Dynasty of Egypt, based on all the four fields of anthropology: cultural anthropology, physical anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and archaeology. Therefore, I would say with confidence that Joseph was the vizier of the Pharaoh in the Middle Kingdom of Egypt in the 12th Dynasty of Egypt. Hopefully this video was educational and beneficial. Be blessed and shalom.